Hello and welcome to Remapping Landscapes at Kylemore Abbey. I'm Frank Monaghan, the Director of Architecture at the Edge, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. I'm actually going to bring up Liz McConnell first, who's the Head of Development at Kylemore Abbey, who is one of our project collaborator. We're presenting this in collaboration with Kylemore Abbey and the Moore Institute at the University of Galway and the Royal Institute of or the Royal Irish Academy. And so I'm going to invite Liz up because we're a little bit late getting started. So we want to get the conversations going straight away. We think we've got a really amazing line of people. I'm going to have my little say after this, but I'm going to get Liz to start first. Okay, thank you, Liz.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Liz McConnell, as Frank said. You're all very welcome to Kylemore Abbey, where on behalf of the Kylemore Trust and the Benedictine community, I'm delighted to welcome you to Fordham Hall here for today's symposium, Remapping Landscapes. Delighted, as Frank said, to be joined by our collaborators in this project here at Kylemore, by Frank Monaghan, founder-director, as you all probably know, of Architecture at the Edge and prime mover in this event, and Professor Jane Conroy and Dr. Nessa Cronin, who've developed the exhibition that you see on the walls here around you for the University of Galway in 2015 as a tribute to the work of the late Tim and Mairead Robinson, and who've programmed today's symposium with Frank. It seems, for me at least, like only a few weeks ago since we launched the exhibition that you can see here last October as the opening event for the Architecture at the Edge annual festival. Since then, the exhibition Interpreting Landscape has been seen by thousands of visitors here at Kylemore Abbey and will hang for another few weeks before it returns to its home at the University of Galway's library. Many of you will know that the room in which we are today has had a number of incarnations. Originally, it was the ballroom of Kylemore Castle, built by Mitchell Henry in the 1860s. Since 1920, it served as a chapel for the Benedictine nuns and for the boarding school here at Kylemore Abbey until 2010. But after 2010, when the nuns moved from the Abbey to the 4 locations that they temporarily live in, it was restored with philanthropic support by a group of Fordham University law graduates, and hence its name is the Fordham Law Great Hall. So that's the story of the building we're in. But this is one of 2 very important American relationships which we enjoy here at Kylemore Abbey. The other, perhaps a little more widely known, is our very active and dynamic relationship with the University of Notre Dame, who since 2016 established the Notre Dame Kylemore Abbey Global Centre here as one of Notre Dame's 12 global education centres. But of course, education has a long and storied history here at Kylemore. The Benedictine nuns' tradition of education goes back to their foundation in 1665 in Ypres in Belgium. And while no longer a school today, that tradition of education continues here in a number of different ways at Kylemore Abbey. I've mentioned the University of Notre Dame, where students and faculty enjoy residential courses here in the building that you can see if you look through the window behind you. Year-round programs with Irish universities and here on-site, benefiting from the unique immersive experience of being in Connemara, but also close to a faith community, a living faith community in the female monastic tradition. Other education programs here, Sister Carol O'Connell leads a very highly regarded music education program in the Kodali method, and short courses are offered in subjects such as spirituality, horticulture, and conservation. So research programs are also underway more recently in areas such as biodiversity with the University of Galway, in social sciences and artificial intelligence with the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany, and in contemplative ecology, very fittingly for today's subject matter, which is a partnership with University of Notre Dame, Loyola Marymount, and Johannes Gutenberg University. So, in another new expression of that commitment to education, Kylemore is seeking to use this space, the space we are in today, as one which will host educational and cultural events, exhibitions, conferences, and activities which will provide a unique resource for this region and its community. and one which brings benefits to the social infrastructure of the area. We have new plans emerging, so hopefully when you're back for next year's conference, if we run one, with Architecture at the Edge, you'll see a very different space here. Writing in Connemara, a little Gaelic kingdom, Tim Robinson described Kylemore Castle as, and I quote, a pale granite dream, afloat on its own reflection, in all the troubling moral ambiguity of aesthetic splendour founded on gross inequality. And while this was true, a castle in Connemara built by and for the wealthy elite at a time of great social inequality, although we should note that Mitchell Henry was regarded as an innovative, progressive and enlightened landowner, the Victorian period from which this place emerges is a place of great inequality. But I'd like to suggest, if I'm not stretching the title of today's symposium to fit here, that over the last century and a half, Kylemore itself has undergone a form of remapping, changing in the process physically, socially, economically, and shaping the social and cultural geography of Connemara. Today, Kylemore welcomes 500,000 visitors a year, employs up to 120 people, generates 60 million for the local economy, which represents about 1,500 jobs in services and tourism in Galway and Mayo, while still being uniquely a social enterprise. So the Kylemore Trust has a mission which is based on preserving the built and natural heritage of the estate for the Irish nation and supporting monastic life and the monastic tradition. So that remapping that we're looking at today perhaps could be applied to Kylemore, so that it's no longer founded on what Tim Robinson called gross inequality, but ensures real social impact for the region, far beyond Mitchell Henry's original pale granite dream. So for a moment, what is the force that has driven that remapping? Well, since the 1920s, Kylemore has been shaped by the values and ethos which the Benedictine nuns brought with them from Ypres, and which are founded on their own unique guiding documents, the Rule of St. Benedict, established in the 6th century. And while these have very unique values for the Benedictine community, they are ones that we can adapt to today's purpose, values like stewardship, showing deliberate care for the place in which we are, represented by the restorations that have taken place over the years, work on invasive species clearance, on economic activity, but which matters to this place. So the values of stewardship, community, living with the common good in mind, developing enterprises which benefit beyond the estate. Moderation, the principle of enough, nothing excessive. And hospitality, welcoming the guest as a priority. These are core to the Benedictines' ethos and have contributed, I'd contend, to the reshaping of Kylemore Abbey today from that pale granite dream into the vital part of the fabric of Connemara, which it now is. And it struck me, just as a small aside, and I'm almost done, that these values, beyond their religious context, deeply resonate with the way in which Tim and Mairead Robinson lived: stewardship, community, moderation, hospitality, enduring values perhaps for us all. So, in conclusion, I'm delighted to have this group here today. It's wonderful to see the Fordham Hall full to capacity. I'd like to thank briefly a couple of people, the exhibition creators, which became the kind of engine for this project, Professor Jane Conroy, Professor Emerita, University of Galway, Vice President of the Royal Irish Academy, and Nessa Cronin, Dr. Nessa Cronin from the Centre for Irish Studies and Director of the Moore Institute at the University of Galway. The exhibition was the engine for this activity that brought us together with Architecture at the Edge, who have been fantastic partners. And I think it's worked pretty well for us, Frank, over the last year. Exactly. I'd like to thank the wonderful roster of speakers that we're going to hear from later today. Speakers representing Atlantic Technological University, University of Galway, UCD, Royal Irish Academy, and a wide range of artists, architects, policymakers, and writers. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues here at Kylemore Abbey, volunteers from Architecture at the Edge, but also the team here, Ethno Halloran, Patricia Joyce, Marguerite Foyle, John O'Toole, and particularly the Benedictine nuns, who I know are delighted to see this place being a place of conversation as we're going to have today. So before I hand over, one very small piece of housekeeping. Last year, I think Jane Conroy presented or identified a stash of the rather difficult to find maps and out-of-print guides to Connemara by Tim Robinson. And we have a very small amount of those, which we're delighted to let you all know, as you're all passionately interested in the topic, are for sale in the Kylemore Abbey Craft and Bookshop, or Craft Shop. If anybody is interested, they're available today. That's my housekeeping job done. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to Architecture at the Edge's founder and director, Frank Monaghan. Frank's passion for architecture and landscape is inspiring. Over the years, he has created a highly respected festival and a programme which we in Kylemore are delighted to have collaborated on, as you said, over several years. We're delighted to have presented the exhibition and symposium, and we look forward to working with Architecture at the Edge in the future. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much, Liz. And yeah, I'm just so grateful to everybody that's been involved in this project. Liz, everybody at Kylemore, the Arts Council, who made everything possible, whose funding actually makes this all happen, and we couldn't do anything without them. So yeah, let's hope that relationship continues as well. The Remapping Landscapes Symposium arose from a desire to celebrate the immense contribution that Tim made to understanding the landscape of the west of Ireland, and that he and Maureen made to stimulating discussion and creative activity among their wide circle of friends and admirers. And I know a lot of those friends and admirers are here today, and I was asked last evening, what was my relationship to Tim and Maureen? Did I know them? How did I know them? I've never had the privilege of actually meeting Tim or Maureen, but it is a privilege to actually have this event here today. And it's almost 3 years, I think it's exactly 3 years since we lost Tim and Maureen. Very soon, their anniversary. But they gifted so much to all of us. And I lived for many, many years in the UK, and I used to be gifted the books, the maps, and that was my connection to this place. And I suppose what Architecture at the Edge try and do in some sort of ways is to strengthen that sort of cultural the idea of architecture as part of culture and that connection to landscape and place that is at the heart of everything that I suppose we are as people and human beings. And I think you'll find some very unique perspectives on what we mean by, in that remapping of what interpretations of landscape is and what place means. I think there'll be some very personal I suppose, testimonies or testaments to Tim and Maureen, but fundamentally we want you to just enjoy yourselves and relax. It is kind of inspired by the conversations that Tim and Maureen had in their own house, the Roundstone conversations, and that's the kind of what we're trying to generate here, and hopefully this will be one of the first ways that we can kind of celebrate the life and work of Tim and continue to do so in the future. We will have Sheila O'Donnell doing our keynote later on today, and she'll talk a little bit about the house in Roundstone and the potential for that as a cultural centre. And I suppose in some ways this is one of those sort of activities that might potentially happen in such a centre should it ever come to fruition, but in a kind of in a setting wherever that might be. You may not need that institution to be bricks and mortar, but you can still have conversations and keep those ideas, I suppose, relevant and current to the kind of challenges that we're facing today. Gone off script there again. So yes, thank you to Nessa and of the Moore Institute in Galway, Jane Conroy, who this was just fantastic working with you both to put this together. For their advice and support in the development of this programme. Thanks also to John Drimver, Folding Landscapes, Pat Collins from Harvest Films, Christina Lowry and members of the Roundstone Community Council. We're hoping to do some events in Roundstone later in the year, so keep following Architecture at the Edge for updates on that. And we extend our deepest appreciation to all of our speakers, artists and contributors. I'm going to invite Fidelma Mullane, who's the first speaker today, to the podium. The first session is called Remapping Connections, Landscape and Architecture. and it'll be moderated by Lorna Siggins, and Fidelma will be the first speaker on that. So, yeah. Lorna, perhaps you want to? Yeah.
Thanks very much, Frank. And I want to thank Frank and Dr. Nessun Cronin of University of Galway for asking me here today. I'm a journalist, and I would have, I last spoke to Tim Robinson just before they were leaving Connemara, and he talked about a life in three halves, and that Tim and Mairead were setting out on their third half, and tragically that was cut short. But an event like this really brings them alive. So the first speaker, Fidelma Mullane, is a cultural geographer specialising in the study of vernacular culture. Advising, teaching and publishing as a specialist and advocate, her work focuses on the topic of vernacular architecture and on the promotion of culturally appropriate contemporary building practices. I'm sure you're all aware of the Connemara trilogy, and in this particular one, The Last Pool of Darkness, there's a wonderful chapter about refloating Inishbofin. There is this myth about how Inishbofin, or this mythical island, was floating back and forth until human intervention fixed it in one spot. And Tim wrote about an expedition that he had undertaken to Inishbofin in 2007, and who was with him only Dr. Fidelma Mullane. As he wrote, his mission was to explore the myth of the floating island, and Fidelma's remit was to document the one remaining thatched house, and the conversation between them is fascinating, and Tim just seems to have documented every single minute. So she's going to talk about that this morning, and so I hand you over to Fidelma.
Good morning, everybody, and many thanks to the organisers for inviting me to speak. Even if it is the first shift, I hope I'll be somewhat coherent for that amount of time, all of 10 minutes. Lorna is correct when she says that we spent that very magical time working, really, on Inishbofin. It's many years ago now, and I'm sure there's nobody in the room who knew Tim who doesn't regret his passing. And that I feel very strongly when I was preparing for this. I found it hard to accept that there were so many things in what I was reading that I wanted to ask him, and why I didn't ask him before now. Now it's not possible. And I have to say, it was entirely my responsibility, because Tim always invited me to go walking, as he did, I think, with other people. And most of the time I was too busy somewhere else, which is a great shame, but that's it. I think Tim and Mairead are such a great loss to us. I think Tim, maybe it's not recognised to any great extent, is his interest in things that are ephemeral, that are almost not fully defined. But he writes about them almost working from the subconscious. Because even when we were doing our field work, he did most of it just walking. He's rarely taking notes. I think he probably took them in the evening. We stayed 2 nights, I think. So he had a very particular way. It's almost as if he didn't exist. And I have taken photographs of him in the landscape, and he just was almost unrecognisable as somebody who was researching, quite different to what people who were studying maybe rural landscapes like this before, where, you know, it wasn't as ethical as Tim's work, which I think has is founded on principles that he lived by and that come through very much in a reading of his work. Now, I became very interested in what we would call foundation myths, and what are they? And if you do see the chapter, in 3 pages, he really gets, I can't establish the time frame because I don't know when the foundation myths started. I sometimes like to think it's pre-archaeology. I know John Waddell would argue with me on that. It is quite ephemeral what he's talking about. And because of that, I think we have to pay very close attention to what he says in these matters. So we talked a lot about the foundation myth of Inishbofin. Now, many societies, many cultures, many countries have foundation myths. It's about bringing the idea of space or of a unit of space into being, how it came into being. And that is a very significant moment. And we tend to, especially geographers, I think, as I am one myself, to concentrate always on the physicality of these things, whereas Tim had both. And if you're reading that chapter, it's really wonderful to read in that he describes the myth and he goes through it and all the rest, and then he launches into describing the physicality of Inishbofin, which is the most beautiful piece of writing on landscape and well worth the read. He goes straight from the myth into this. So I just quote him briefly about the foundation myth. He says, the foundation myth of Inishbofin may seem foolish, ancient foolishness, unfounded in reality, but it is well and wisely founded in the unfoundedness of reality itself. He gives this account of the foundation myth that I will read his account rather than talking about it because I know I have a short time. He says, and he gives a summary, ages ago there was an island that floated to and fro in the mist. Some fog-bound fishermen came across it one day, landed and lit a fire, or some say, shook the ash out of a pipe onto it. As soon as the island was touched by fire, and Tim adds in, that is by technology, that is a wild element, fire, tamed by humanity. It became fixed. And this, I won't read the whole thing, but I will in a minute. He himself concentrated completely on this moment when it went from being ephemeral, not tied down, it had a lightness, it didn't have a physicality. So he goes from that state of an island to the state where it's an element tamed by humanity. So he recounts the precise moment when this happened. The mist cleared and the fishermen found themselves on a shingle bank between the sea and a lake. They saw an old woman driving a white cow down to the water. She struck it and it became a rock. One of the fishermen ran to strike the hag, and both she and he turned into rocks too. The metaphor, he really carries on the metaphor all the time. The cow has occasionally been seen since then, its appearance foretelling some disaster. Hence, Inishbofin, the island of the white cow. And so we go from a space that is ephemeral, which is the island, then we come to the white cow, which is mythical, has properties and attributes that belong to its special role in Inishbofin, this white cow, which was equally ephemeral. It equaled the ephemerality of the island before human intervention. Hence, Inishbofin, the island of the white cow. This is Tim's summary of the story as told to John O'Donovan in 1839. Tim refers to the Ordnance Survey as that great mission of fixing and naming. So here we are with the idea of fixed. Suddenly, very abruptly, it seems, we're moving from this ephemeral, this light form to something fixed, which is a different, I suppose, state of being, if you can say that about an island. From these accounts, we get a sense that islands are first and foremost moving entities, advancing and retiring, in and out of reality, floating, hidden in the mist. So also the white cow appearing and disappearing, only seen occasionally, its appearance foretelling a disaster of one kind or another, after which it disappears again. As to whether the foundation myth relating to Inishbofin is known on the island today, I cannot say. We were there in 2007. The island is currently understood as fixed. That means it's tied to a base. That is to say, disenchanted, because it's the most important property of the pre-physicality is the fact that it's enchanted. And the nearest word I could find to it, I spoke to quite a few people as to what are the earlier definitions of enchanted, and it's actually very difficult to find. But of course, as always in Ireland, you find it in the Irish language. So did a trawl, and we found, it wasn't me that found it, but it is the word I was looking for, and that is driocht, which is kind of a spell or magic. It means it's a certain type of conserved space. I won't say that it's holy or blessed, as you often read in the poems surrounding High Brazil, but it has that innate sense. The island is currently understood as fixed, that is to say disenchanted, in contrast with the original Inishbofine that was a floating, enchanted island. But we do know that the foundation myth is evoked wherever the place Inishbofine is used. So that is such a wonderful name, Inishbofine. You know, that foundation myth is recalled every single day. There's another very nice, and I'll only read you a few lines from it, description of this kind of floating island. Now, before I go on to that, I noticed in reading some of these that it's expressed in oppositions and dualities. So it's floating versus fixed to a base. Enchantment, being under a spell, magic, a world of mystery and enchantment, versus disenchantment, appearance, disappearance, visible, invisible. The idea that islands alternate between floating and fixed. Floating implies appearance, disappearance, advancing from the fog or mist. Such characteristics also applied to the white cow. Now, Roderick O'Flaherty, in the late 18th century, he used the word enchanted when he was describing, I think it's not quite the same concept, because the concept of a floating island is not the same as a drowned city, as some people equate with High Brazil. And he gives a description of one such example. I'm more interested in the floating island. And Tim was as well. So we explored this whole business of the floating island. And Tim's article, or the chapter in the book, is entitled Refloating Inishbofin. And the belief is that it was enchanted and it was floating, but now it's fixed and it's disenchanted. So I think that is what defines this approach, as opposed to the lost city of Atlantis or all of those explorations, are all very valid, but not quite what we're looking at here. So in the three accounts of floating given by Tim of floating islands, the common associated features are fog, mist, fire, and fishermen. They come up in all of them. Though fire plays a central role in the origin story, as was the case with many oral cultures, the story varies from place to place, from storyteller to storyteller, adding credibility to the story. In the foundation myth of Inishbofin, there is a suggestion that the fire may have happened accidentally. And I quote, some fog-bound fishermen came across it one day, landed and lit a fire, and some say shook the ash out of a pipe onto it. It was somebody emptying the little cinders of the Pope's pipe smoking, and this caused the fire. And that's at that moment that it became disenchanted. But it's a very good account from Omi, where the fire is described explicitly as an accident, where a father and son are fishing for mackerel. Some of the fire that was being lit to cook the mackerel fell overboard, and all at once, a beautiful island burst on his view, just within minutes of his boat, just within 5 fathoms of his boat, and he had nothing to do but push on shore and look about him. So this is the moment that humanity gets to the island. And I think this is, we can use this to discuss the Anthropocene as well, because we have it here in the foundation myths, that precise moment. Now, those, a lot of work obviously done on the Anthropocene, it is not, we don't really know what it is. Some people say it's not the Anthropocene unless it has interfered with or has added or changed the stratigraphy of a place. I disagree with that for no reason other than I think it was probably a more flexible thing. It's not so rigid. But the beginning of the introduction of humanity into the picture, that is the moment when everything changes. Now, I have a very long piece here, which I'm going to skip now. But I would like to read you Roderick O'Flaherty's description, if I can find it. which I think is quite nice because it's early, but I'm sure there are earlier ones. Sorry, now I have it here. I should have it. Yeah. But O'Flaherty was talking about Arran. From the Isles of Arran, and this was in 1684, the Isles of Arran and the West Continent often appears visible, that enchanted island or Brazil. And he spells enchanted, I-N, enchanted. And in Irish, Beg Ara, or the Lesser Arran, set down in cards of navigation. Whether it be real and firm land kept hidden by special ordinance of God, as the terrestrial paradise, or else some illusion of airy clouds appearing on the surface of the sea, or the craft of evil spirits, is more than our judgment can sound out. So it's a very interesting piece of writing. So I just want to say, I presume I'm running out of time. I'm not even looking over at Lorna. Yes, so I propose that the origin story is a mapping of the commencement of the Anthropocene. And I call it a first mapping, because from the detail of the long stories, which are quite extraordinary, especially in Ireland, I think we have a great storytelling tradition. And I call it a first mapping, because everything in the myth, in the telling of the myth, you can roll it out. You can actually, I suppose, map it. And this is the connection, I think, with Tim. First mapping becomes possible when islands are actively disenchanted. That is, according to Tim's description, by the introduction of a wild element, fire, tamed by humanity. I suggest that we can associate the beginning of the fixing of a floating island as the beginning of the Anthropocene in that place, because it is place specific, as with our case today, the examples of 2 islands off the west coast of Ireland. The origin story, foundation myth, legend, can be understood as a marker, a map of the taming, disenchantment of the islands of Inishbofin and Omagh. Now, this is why I absolutely love this piece, because, and then I'll be finishing. We were walking past the harbour and we noticed that there were incredibly significant coastal erosion works going on. And to me, it seems, when I read you this, that is actually quite extraordinary, because what was happening on Inishbofin when we were there fits in so neatly with the foundation myth that it's really extraordinary. We were really transfixed by this. So I'll give you just Tim's writing on that. And I might show some photographs. Yes, actually, that's the photograph there. You can see the slabs of concrete down low. Well, they're quite high. I think about 20 metres high, and the cliff is about 50 metres high. And here's the island being surrounded by these. Now, I differ with Tim on this. He feels that this is the refloating of Inishbofin, which I think is, I have to admit. But I'm saying no, it's actually a temporary fixing. We'll delay the refloating, and so we'll protect. But whatever way we look at it, I think it's very extraordinary that here it is, this island, because it is glacial till, is going to disappear one day. And we will be left with some kind of reminder, and that is something we can hardly define, like ghost-type island. Again, it'll be sailing in and out of the mist. It will have no physicality. And I want to pay a tribute here to, I think Dorothy Cross is here, I see you at the back, because it reminded me just of how profound the notion of the ghostliness of these things. And Dorothy's ghost ship either she had done quite amazing research, or it was the artist's, intuity that brought this marvellous piece of ghost ship to us. Now, just the last thing, this is pertaining to the works going on. And Tim writes, we were astonished by the scale of coastal protection work going on below this cliff, which is of glacial till and has been eaten back by cliff falls until the tower and the road are threatened with imminent collapse. Here we are. The island is breaking down. It's going to be a ghost island with climate change? You know, maybe it'll take 1,000 years, maybe 100, no idea. Part of this 50-foot cliff has already been armoured with gabions, cuboid parcels of stones 6 or 7 feet long in stout wire mesh, stacked in course upon course. Further west, a zigzag Berlin wall of concrete panels 20 feet tall were being constructed below the cliff, and the space behind it filled with silt dredged out of the inner reaches of the harbour and pumped through a fat blue tube that lay like a monstrous snake along the foreshore. And that is that photograph. So, from the foundation myth, we can agree to differ as to whether it's going into its old phase of being, again, with a non-physical presence, or we can say that we're holding off the time by putting up these works. From my own understanding, the sea level rise orchestrated by climate change will restore Inishbofin from disenchantment to enchantment, from fixed to floating. By such works as described, refloating will be held off for the moment. I suggest that eventually, when the island loses its physical form, it will refloat as a ghost island. What is astonishing is the fact that the fixed island is envisaged one more time as returning to the state of a floating island, as described in the foundation story, advancing and retreating, appearing and disappearing, returning to enchantment. Tim's interpretation of how Inishbofin might be refloated depends on its re-enchantment, to become invisible like all the others in the far western sea, and only spied at times, and then passing away again like a fog bank. And just the last piece that Tim wrote, soon it stopped, and this is the corncrake singing. Perhaps the bird had flown. Perhaps its stubby little wings had given the island enough of a lift to float it into Scohin's world, where salmon swim beneath. Thank you very much.
Sit in there.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Fidelma. We can hear the corncrake singing. So our next speaker, Tom Cookson, is an associate in Hall McKnight's Cork office, an architect currently leading housing, public realm and cultural projects within Ireland. Tom's writing has been published by Drawing Matter, and his thesis project at the MSA shortlisted for the RIBA Silver Medal. He was awarded the LINA, I hope I say that right, Writing Award in January of this year, a collaboration between the Irish Architectural Foundation and dpr-Barcelona for an essay entitled Shallow Time, the Burren, which he is going to give us a snapshot of. And some of the themes include brevity and infinity, the connection of Earth to the cosmos, an introduction to deep time, the Anthropocene being the latest layer, shallow time, the field walls of the Burren as egoless anti-monuments, very interesting idea, and the relationship between wedge, portal and court tombs of the Burren, including Paul Brone, and the context of thickened space. So, hand over to you.
Thanks, Lorna. So I'm going to start by talking at the broadest possible scale about the cosmos. So the first Neolithic settlers to arrive in the Burren, they would have had this innate connection to the heavenly bodies. The secular and spiritual world were one and the same thing. And I guess as we've kind of been driven by a world of industrial time, artificially illuminated by artificial light, we've lost this connection to the planetary bodies. And I guess as we think about the relationship of the Earth to the cosmos, we can also think about how our ancestors' location on the dome surface of our planet, I guess how that influenced their societal groupings, the kind of beginnings of their culture. And I suppose we can then begin to start to discuss about how geology, anthropology, and culture have kind of got one and the same relationship. So just to introduce deep time, it has the same kind of sensibility to this idea of a connection to the planetary bodies. Deep time is geological time, it's lithic time. It deals with spans of billions and millions of years, whereas humans, we're kind of dealing with a much more kind of local idea of biological time, which is about tens to hundreds of years, and we struggle to project our minds forward to this kind of idea of a deep time. And as Fidelma said, the Anthropocene is this kind of latest layer of the geological ledger. It's the latest human-impacted layer of the kind of geological strata. And when it started, I'm sure will be discussed later, is disputed. We could say that it was the first kind of act of humans to shape the landscape and to define territory. Equally, we could say that it would be the dawning of the atomic age. But despite that being disputed, what is indisputable is that we've shaped our landscape so fundamentally. We're now the primary geomorphic agents on this planet, humans. We move more land and earth than natural forces. And the Burren is a karst landscape. The deep time is close to the surface. It's been shaped by natural forces, by glacial movement, carrying these kind of bodies of ice and rock. And you can see in the center of the image, these erratics, often pink Galway granite, will be incongruously strewn on an ash and limestone pavement, talking about this kind of journey which happened millions of years ago. And the Burren is also a soluble landscape. Lightly acidic rain dissolves the ash and limestone pavement to create the grikes that you can see in the image. And it contains this underworld, this kind of series of volumes and caverns which are caused by this soluble landscape being eroded by rainfall. And I suppose to kind of talk briefly about my study, so it traces the tension between depth and shallowness, I suppose most expressly through the modern movement. So we can look at this image, which is a Sean Scully painting, and we can talk about how his kind of precursors in the abstract expressionist movement, they were rejecting perspectival space. They were rejecting the idea of the Renaissance tradition of taking a flat surface and projecting infinity onto it. And they were searching for depth in shallow spaces, in shallow surfaces, which we can also trace that, I guess, that idea through to contemporary architectural practice as well. And this is a struggle that I guess Tim Robinson also dealt with. He was walking the landscape, but he was creating these maps which I guess were translating this three-dimensional experience into a flat surface. He was compressing experiences, conversations, interpretations of the landscape into a two-dimensional surface. And so we've moved from the cosmos to planet Earth to the Burren to the natural shape in a landscape. And I guess when we explore the Burren, one of the kind of primary human impacts that we see there are the field walls. And they're monumental in their impact on the landscape, but my study suggests that they're anti-monuments. They were built by many hands, they're egoless, they're authorless, they require shaping and tending, and they have an informal directness in the way that they trace their path across the landscape. It's direct in that it's the act of humankind, but that directness is tempered by the contingency of the landscape and its topography. And in amongst these field walls, you have, I guess, the next level up of human imposition on the landscape. You have the tombs, the court, wedge, and as you can see here, the portal tomb at Burren. And these are placed in and amongst these field walls, and they therefore kind of define a centre and periphery amongst the constructed landscape of the Burren. And what they contain is they contain this kind of thickened space, which it kind of resonates amongst the kind of vertical, figurative kind of pieces of limestone that you can see here, but it projects that character out into the landscape. And we can also trace this idea through to the modern movement. So this is Donald Judd's Spring Street studio in New York. And he was kind of charting this shift from an idea of sculpture being a solid mass that is kind of carved and shaped, but ultimately remains as this kind of body in space. And he suggested that this classical tradition, in fact, kind of deeper into time than classical tradition, could be challenged. And he suggested that the space within a more mute volume could actually be the sculpture. And he takes that a step further. He rejects the museum as an institution. he suggests that his pieces should only be situated within spaces that he also designs. And in that tension, you get this kind of series of resonant volumes which are kind of acting on each other. And so this is the last slide. Just to conclude, I suppose what my study suggests is that these kind of portal tombs, which are situated within the Burren, they act both in the modernist tradition of framing space, but they also hold the kind of figurative character of a kind of classical sculpture. They do one and these kind of same things. But interestingly, we think, or at least I think, of the type as a replicable thing, as something that's kind of intuitively connected to the modern movement. But actually, these tombs are types replicated across the landscape. And they're transformed from types into characters in their siting in the landscape. So you're getting this kind of resonation between objects and environments. And yeah, that's the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Our third speaker, Dr. Finola O'Kane, is a landscape historian, architect and professor at the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy at UCD. Her books include Landscape Design in 18th Century Ireland, Mixing Foreign Trees with the Natives, published in 2004, and the forthcoming Landscape Design and Revolution in Ireland and the United States, 1688 to 1815. In 2017, she was elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy. And Dr. O'Kane is going to speak to the theme Sharp Gradients of Landscape History in Connacht, Connemara and Tim Robinson's work. It will develop a chapter, Sharp Gradients of Landscape History in the 19th Century Irish Country House Garden, which she published last year as part of Digging New Ground, the Irish Country House Garden 1650 to 1900, and that contained research on Kylemore. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. O'Kane.
Is mór an honor dom bheith an seo inniu I gcaint le choulúidir cho Galánta agus cho Éireamúil agus a deanta Tim Robinson ar an mala chomá. Tógu gá hangach mé go hóras go nathí agus clóisís con a máilioch lia I deanta le muintir Vicanummer. Níos déine rinne mé staidir ar an Altracht UCD, céinar hiig mo bhúntóirí an chuid is módóibh ó Iarchonacht, Cád an áíire a dhéanach altere I gcompóid leis an dlí, nú lais, nú staidir ar an tanga féin. So sa fórpar seo ba méid dailá leis na bórthir cléanta seo a ranamíd idir an tanga agus an tíorgrach a thomas go léir ag siúl. So I was just explaining the very sharp gradients that brought me to this place. And just to acknowledge also that I've always avoided actually the sharp gradients of Connemara, partly because they're too like home, but also because in comparison to other parts of Ireland, they are very sharp indeed. And this painting, this is an 1845 painting that Prince Albert, consort of Queen Victoria, a prescient painting, bought in a gallery in London. And the artist, like many before him, of course, is depicting Killarney. But he's also including a barefoot child scrambling to rebalance a tipping milk pail beside a basket of potatoes. And he placed stones everywhere, falling from a ruined church, protruding from the soil and running in walls over barren hills. The year in which he bought this painting was the year when the potato blight arrived, and setting in train a calamitous pattern of decline that halved a population of 8.5 million to 4, making Ireland one of the few depopulated countries in the world. The historians and geographers who study famine landscapes mostly favour economic analyses and the detailed mapping of demography, poverty and disease. Yet designed landscapes were laid out throughout the famine years, and great gardens existed, relatively unscathed at times, by the tragedy unfolding outside their walls. These are the sharp landscape gradients that prevail when greenhouses with pineapples stand but a few miles from a failing potato crop, with all the moral myopia that implies. So I'm going to trace two sharp gradients that fascinate me in the West. One is here in Kylemore, and the previous photo is that gradient. And it's very interesting, I find, that Tim Robinson called this, or just a few meters away from us, a garden. One of the few English it's the only garden named that I could find on the map of Connemara. So we can trace these gradients, sharp gradients, in all compass directions from where we now sit, except for a few leading to Renville House, Rossleague, points along the Skye Road and towards Balnahinch. At Kylemore, we can also remember architecture's descent and origin in gentlemanly pursuits, an ancestry that rubs along somewhat uncomfortably with the rural humdrum and everyday quotidian quality of most Irish architecture. Gentlemanly travels, for example, created the Italian garden that once stood at the knuckle of Kylemore's lakes and from which the pampas grasses, in cahoots with the rhododendrons, sallied forth to conquer the hillsides and the bogs. Profoundly visual, and this is just to describe the before and after OS maps of Kylemore, which turned it into a garden. And that extraordinary importation of the walled garden with its greenhouses into the wilds of Connemara that Mitchell Henry built. So profoundly visual, anyway, architectural education inculcates international aesthetics via drawings and images in its charges for all who've undertook architectural education. And trained eyes mostly pass judgment quickly, often lacking deeper knowledge of the patterns and rationale of natives and that of the soil itself. Kylemore is the only garden marked on Robinson's map of Connemara, a singularity and a language that suggests critique. In 1872, the anonymous Dubliensis also published a general assessment of the condition of Irish gardening in 4 parts in the architectural periodical The Irish Builder. It concluded with an account of Kylemore, the most elaborate and recent attempt, and I quote, which characterised an effort at solving for the first time in Ireland, or rather worked out, a great horticultural problem, which was, of course, poverty. Constructed by the Manchester cotton magnate, and I'm not going to trace that sharp gradient, which ends up somewhere in the United States, Mr. Mitchell Henry, the estate then consisted of 300,000 acres, an immense area, which facilitated the construction of a landed estate in a most unexpected location, Connemara, one of the poorest regions in 19th century Europe, and at a seemingly inopportune time, namely in the aftermath of Ireland's Great Famine of 1845 to 49. But it was also a very serious attempt to change the landscape of a very deprived environment. And Dubliensis argued that Kylemore was a model landscape and its owner a model landlord, because the landscape could demonstrate clear improvements in 3 design disciplines of concern: gardening, architecture, and implicitly farming. And I think the previous quote showed how he thought that they should be really the same thing. Kylemore's design also incorporated these technological experiments, such as this cross-section of a greenhouse by James Cranston, although officially, according to the article, designed by Mr. Garnier, Kylemore's head of staff. And Cranston, in his catalogue, is very clear about how he's changing the sharp gradients of greenhouses to move to a totally different scale. He's using glass in a very elegant manner, minimising brick and walls, and advocating the entire absence of a framed joiner's work, such as sashes or lights, either sliding or fixed. So he creates these extraordinary profiles that were preferably curved or arched, so that curvilinear roofs of any contour could be constructed. And we have photos of what they looked like. The other sharp gradient I want to talk about, and the other item of English usage in these bilingual landscapes, is that which prevailed between the Lord Lieutenant's Lodge on Inverlake and Patrick Pearse's cottage. And this is their very close location. So Pearse and the Lord Lieutenant essentially looked across the road at each other for a period of time. And Pearse's identity, of course, is, like Tim Robinson's, a mixed identity. And when he was in the West, he was very firmly an Englishman. So the challenge that he faced in trying to convince the natives that he might educate them was very sharp indeed. And these are the two environments. I don't have a photo of Inverlodge, so this is Screeb, which is very close by and where he also stayed. But just to talk about this kind of this issue of identity, which I think is also acute in Tim Robinson, the outsider coming in, Pádraig Ó Conairí described, and I'm also using Pearse because I understood Connemara first through Pearse's writings, because we were taught them so much at school. So Pearse was one of those who founded the Connemara colony in Dublin, people who used to spend short holidays in the Gaeltacht of the West and who would only speak Irish while there. And continuing his unexpected association of Pearse with colonial practices, he wrote that these West-seeking Dubliners were surely the first Gaelgori from Dublin who made an invasion of the Gaeltacht. So, coincidentally, across the road, William Humble Ward, the second Earl of Dudley, had selected the same small corner of Connemara for his residence on a fishing lodge developed by the Guinness family in the late 18th century. And the two men set about educating the locality's schoolchildren with warring slideshows that pitted the triumphal march of the British Empire against Pearse's imagined Gaelic and rural Ireland. And these took place in two contrasting environments. Dudley's within the afternoon fete tenant dinner type environment that we're now in, of Inverlodge, and then Pearse's as a schoolmaster delivering a lecture to small children generally in a national schoolhouse, purpose-built for education. And then I also wanted to just briefly mention this kind of character that prevails, I think, in Robinson's work and also through his maps, these two instances. But these bilingual maps, so termed, are interesting, particularly when he uses English rather than Irish. Not surprising, perhaps, at the Garden in Kilmore, but very much so at Teach an Phiarsaigh in Rosmuc. And just why he made that decision, I think, is very interesting. And I was also very distracted looking at the Connemara map again by his foray into cadastral mapping, where great care is typically taken for taxation purposes to map the ownership of land, and which we do not have in Ireland in the way that they have in mainland Europe. So this he does for areas of forestry, and I'm interested to know, particularly visible around Monturk, where the great Trinity College Dublin estates are, which I think would be very interesting to research. So he's mapping public and private areas of ownership of forestry, but he doesn't do it for the great estates, the Martins, the Blakes, and these are great fault lines in the perceptual, economical and political boundaries of these landscapes. So they're omitted from the map, except where they're forests. So to conclude, such gradients prevail across the maps and writings of Tim Robinson, if not perhaps in as sharp a fraught or contentious a manner as they do in the 19th century. We are also tracing today, I think, longer gradients between Connacht and Dublin and between Connacht and mainland Europe that also portray long inequities and conflicted identities. We could also trace the ongoing gradients between rich and poor, Irish and English, but most of us, like Tim Robinson, are positioned somewhere along the incline, in a shifting bilingual territory of many identities, ideally not warring, but always very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Dr. O'Kane. So we have a few minutes for questions. I just wanted to ask the panel, first of all, if any of them have questions for each other's presentation. No, you're all happy? So just, are there any questions out there? Or up there? I might just kick off. I might just ask Fidelma. Fidelma, what was it like actually doing a field, walking out with Tim Robinson and doing field work with him?
Oh, it's very, I suppose, difficult to define, because he was so restrained himself and so ethical, and he let me do the talking, and he spoke very little, and we walked many times different parts of the island. He took very few notes. I think he must have written them up in the evening or early morning. He was almost, you know, my abiding memory of him is just, he was barely touching the surface of the earth, even when he walked. He walked so lightly. He didn't carry a whole lot of equipment but recording or photographs or nothing like that. So it was feeding his imagination, and then he did an awful lot of research as well. So I, like many others, gave him lots of references and that kind of thing. But it is really that he was so present in the landscape and yet almost invisible. And he also loved learning things, and even my area of research, which is fairly little known as a topic, he didn't have that much information on it. So when we went to the ruin, you know, he just stood there and I explained what this feature was, that feature, the others, the walls, floors, everything. And he found that, he was captivated by that. He loved something that was completely new. And he would throw in the odd thing then that he wasn't sure of himself to see what I would think of it, particularly in relation to buildings. He really was so respectful of anybody we met, or even when I was giving him information and all that. He paid a lot of attention. He was very concentrated. But my abiding memory is his lightness of touch as a field worker.
Thank you. Tom, how much of an influence was Tim Robinson's work on your essay, which, by the way, will be available, I think, to read later this year, won't it? Shallow Time, the Burren.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, I guess as an outsider coming to Ireland, I'm kind of approaching it with a kind of similar sensibility, kind of looking very carefully, not treading too heavily. And I guess that was the first reference point that kind of set me off on the path to, I guess, think about how I could interpret the Burren in a slightly different way, with an interest in deep time, an interest in abstract expressionism and this kind of change in the way that artists began to think about what it is to kind of bring something into the world, similar to the way that Fidelma was talking about the origin story. And yeah, I guess Tim Robinson's work was a natural kind of progression from that sensibility to kind of facing into writing 15,000 words about something that you're broadly unfamiliar with. I'm an architect. I go into an office every day and I problem solve and I think about these issues more broadly, but yeah, it's not really my world. But yeah, I think Tim Robinson was a good way to kind of an in for me, essentially.
Oh yeah, question here. Yeah.
If I may?
Yeah.
So I only wanted to ask Finola something because I think Tim has had all kinds of readers, and we each take our own thing out of what he writes, and there's always a personal response based on the landscape that we know, or based on the places we know, but also based on our professions. And I just wondered if there's an architectural reading of Tim's, or if you feel yourself responding as an expert in architecture differently to the way you might respond if you had put that part of your brain away and weren't thinking that way. I just wondered whether the architectural detail, and Fidelma showed us images as well that, you know, do focus on buildings and so on. I just wondered if that is different for you.
Oh, I'm probably so mixed up now that I can't tell. I was thinking about the education of an architect briefly, you know, in this paper, and the extent to which it's extremely visual. So we acquire an expertise that's fast and very judgmental on design, in design terms, in visual composition. And I think what's interesting about reading Tim Robinson, and the first time I would have read him was actually with John and Sheila when I was a student, and we went on a fourth-year trip to the Aran Islands. And, you know, so it was interesting, having gone through a few years of architectural education, it was interesting to return to language. And his great ability to express landscape in language. Although I do think his consciousness of not having Irish must have been very acute. And having come at Aran through a bilingual education as a child, I knew Aran because in a way half my teachers had been from Aran, and I'd done sean-nós with Porky Ní Whalon, who was from Aran. So it was a mixture of traditions and educational experiences that I still draw on. But architecture sits uncomfortably frequently with those traditions. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
Gurmil Mahagi, Harkeen. I worked on and off with Tim over 40 years, and Tim was very conscious of his Englishness within an Irish setting. And that's something you have to read through a lot of his texts. He was very conscious of the political situation he was within, and nervous at times within that, because we were in the middle of the troubles at the time, as you know. And I go back to sort of the early account for the first Englishman that leaves us this fantastic account of Connemara, which is John Dunton. And he comes to Connemara in 1698, and he says, comes to Connemara to see the last of the wild, barbarous Irish in their uncivilized state. Now, people, when they hear that first, they think barbarous Irish, was he insulting there? He wasn't. He was complimenting. He was coming to see the old Irish, the traditional ways, the culture that was rapidly disappearing by the end of the 17th century as the Gaelic elite gave way to a new elite. And Tim really was following that journey. He was at a time when the language shift was happening, and as it is happening, throughout Connemara and the Aran Islands. And he was very conscious of that absolute necessity to record the names, the Cushwinch, or the ordinary people. He wasn't among us, if you like, he was among the general population. And that's where he was most comfortable on his bike, going through in that very modest but incredibly impactful way as he moved through the Connemara and the Arden landscape. So I think his legacy is immense. But there are big areas, like the places that he doesn't record, the comments he doesn't make. And those are because his nervousness of his background as an Englishman coming into a world that was transformed by Irishmen. So I thought your observations were fantastic in that how he dealt with those things. And so there's a lot more we can pull out of those wonderful texts that he's left us, this huge legacy that we've all benefit from. Come in, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Anybody else? Any more questions? Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Frank, I think. Oh, there is one more question, is there? Sorry.
More questions? Comments? Observations?
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thanks very much for coming.